Okay, Tommy, I think at this point we should go over to Rolf and see if he has the unenviable task of coming up with an anecdote that will top Tommy's. But Rolf, you've made Tracker and 10 Canoes, as Katrina told us. Could you talk a little bit about the process? I mean, I've heard you talk before about helping people to tell their stories, and just could you talk a little bit about how you go through that process?
Sure. I'm just worried about these three, all from the Northern Territory. I think it constitutes an invasion.
We've got the crocodile, Rolf.
My entry into this whole area, I think, is obviously quite different. But I do remember grappling with at least elements of it from way back. The very first film that I ever made was a children's film, and there was a part for a woman in it, and it was a simple, normal Anglo-Saxon story. And I ran across somebody and became friends with a disabled Aboriginal woman, and so I thought I'd solve all the problems at once, and I cast her in that role. And also remember in Bubby writing a scene quite specifically for Indigenous actors to be in it, because it felt wrong that wasn't in some way part of the film. The 10 Canoes, I think, is interesting because a couple of times in my life I've made a film where I have felt more that I am the facilitator for somebody to tell their story. And Dance Me to My Song with Heather Rose, who had cerebral palsy, was the first of those. And I think we all felt that we were making Heather's film for Heather. And 10 Canoes very much was a question of me being asked to make a film with David and his mob on their land, and eventually agreeing to do so. And in the process, understanding how difficult it was going to be up there and how difficult it was up there, setting up a structure that enabled them to not just feel that they had input, but feel that they ultimately had control, and not that they chose to exercise it very much, because they understood that I'm the filmmaker. But I think they all felt that if they said no, I would say, fine, what will we do instead? Let's work this out. It was never a question of me attempting to impose my view of what this film should be, but only to argue if they were diverging from what they wanted to do, which would, because really what they said was, we want to make a film that is a movie. Okay, David, who knew the most about all of this sort of stuff, he fell by the wayside very early on in the piece, and so I was making the film with people who had no experience at all, and they wanted to make a film that people could see anywhere in the world, and it had to be a movie, like it had to play in cinemas, and that's what they wanted. And it was so that people could see their culture and value it in some way, because for 100 years they'd been told their culture was of no value at all, and they didn't quite believe that, and so they wanted their culture validated. And so then they'd say, well, we want this, or we want this, or we don't want that, and I'd say, okay, well, that's fine. Understand, however, that you are doing this by doing that. And look, these conversations, of course, much more complex and much more time-consuming. But yes, we can do that, but it becomes a reconstructed ethnographic documentary, which is not what you said you wanted. Okay? So then, okay, well, right, then we'll do what you are saying. Yep, okay, fine, we'll go back to that. And so that whole process was one where my task was a very peculiar one, which was to try and get the film made. Yes, in the end, I directed it in a manner of speaking, and largely I did, although there were whole areas of things that, as a director, that I would normally have done that I didn't do, like casting, like selecting locations. The casting was done by the community, the locations I was told where we were shooting, and then to try and make it work. And ultimately it was, obviously a wonderful success insofar as the film got finished. It has merit, it played in cinemas around the world, and it validated their culture in a way that they found truly, truly wonderful. So that was fantastic. Tracker was very different because the Tracker was more about me in a way, and it is as much a white story in a way. Tracker came about because I was doing research for another Indigenous project that I'd been asked to do, and it was a first contact story. And I kept coming across material that, this was back in 1991, I think, when I was researching. And so that's in the history of black-white relationships in this country. That's, in some senses, quite a long time ago, because a lot has changed since then. But I kept running across material that so, well, it moved me, I guess, and very broadly. It made me very angry. It made me angry that at school they'd given us a comic book at primary school that purported to explain the history of Indigenous culture in this country since white people came. And it was clearly ludicrous. When you read about, in Victoria, an activity used to be to get a black fella and cut his guts open, nail the end of his intestine to a tree, and then force him to walk around and around the tree unirreverently. Okay, that made me so angry that I knew nothing of that this was completely unrecognised, this was an obscure document. And then I read about Captain David Wiltshire, who by his own hand was reputed to have shot 2,000 Aboriginals in his efforts to clean up the centre, which was his job. That you think, okay, so the Tracker came out in this torrent of anger that I had, which I then couldn't make. I couldn't write the script. I had this story, this treatment written. I couldn't write the script. And it was not until 10 years later that Peter Sellers and Bridget Eichen approached me about doing film for the Adelaide Festival. Did I have anything that had Indigenous themes that was blah, blah? I said, well, as a matter of fact, I do. And so the Tracker was able to be made. Now, through its making, it became more the Tracker's story than it was as written, but that was David's genius. And it was our seeing that genius and allowing it to flower. But ultimately it was my film in a way that 10 Canoes isn't. 10 Canoes is the community's film.